Thank you so much, Tanya and Murray, and what a beautiful introduction. And thank you. I feel a little bit teary having that kind of entry into this beautiful community of Rotarians and peace builders. And happy birthday. What an extraordinary moment. 100 years. When you were all sitting in the Stotts Hotel 100 years ago, I don't imagine that you would make this journey as far as you've come. And it's a testament to the fact that we start today on the next 100 years. So I'm very much excited to be wanting to reflect with you all today on where we are in conflict and where we are in peace and what we need to do to lead on into that journey. I wanted to start by actually not reflecting back on 100 years, but actually on maybe the last decade. And I think 5 significant things have happened in our world which have impact on us in terms of our own peace building, peace leadership. And the first one is really the rise of very complex, very violent conflicts, such as Syria, such as Yemen, such as we've seen in the last few weeks in Myanmar. They're the kind of conflicts which transcend borders. They're not really just about Syria. They're actually about competing regional interests. They're about economies. They're about big business. They're also about geopolitics. And I think that back in the day when we had conflicts around Aceh, around Timor-Leste in our own region, even Bougainville, they were not lesser conflicts, but they were more simple. They were conflicts between the state and an armed group. They were easier to mediate. It was possible to find more time-bound solutions to them. And I'm grateful that we have worked so hard on finding peace agreements in those places. But the kinds of conflicts that we're dealing with now are complicated. It's not just a matter of flying in a UN envoy, sending a powerful mediator in to put 2 parties together and make an agreement. And so that requires us to have a rethink, to think, how do we handle this level of complexity? When one man's actions on one day on February 1st in Myanmar leads to a complex web of actors and stakeholders trying to work out, how do we reduce violence? How do we get back to business? How do we handle the refugee flows? There's so much to them and so much work to be done across the board. So we need to rethink. The second thing that's happened in the last decade, or perhaps a little more, is the expansion of our colleagues in China. And China has really changed its internal policies to come out into the world. The Belt Road Initiative, which extends across the planet, is something for those of us to think about who work on peace, but also people in business, in mining, in all kinds of places where there's benefit to that, but also challenges. I think it's really set us in what might be called a new kind of Cold War era, where we see the US and China eyeing each other off in Alaska, where Australia is struggling to work out where does it position itself in relation to this discourse. What do we do about big issues like South China Sea, Taiwan, and even, as I said earlier, Myanmar. The other thing that we've seen in this last decade is the rise of an extraordinary generation of leaders, young people who are uncompromising, who almost take no prisoners, who are not willing to accept the status quo. They manifest in very different ways. In the Milk Tea Alliance, for example, in politics, we've seen people like Malala stand up to the Taliban. We've seen people like Joshua Wong speak for what he holds true in Hong Kong and in China. We've seen people like Greta Thunberg travel the planet, reminding us of such a critical message about climate change. And so these kinds of young people, some of them not even yet 18, are really taking on the big issues of our planet and challenging us to think out of the box, to be different. And again, no compromises by them. We've seen them this last few weeks, again in Myanmar, young woman called Angel who stood up and was shot down and lost her life for what she believed in, a world that could be different, an end to structural violence in the system that she had been raised in. So third element is young people. The fourth is something that I think we're really experiencing in Australia, and we're seeing it manifest in different ways around the world, and it's been bubbling away below the surface for some time. It might be portrayed as a conflict between men and women, but I don't think it's that. I think it's a tension between two ways of working. One might be described as a feminist way of working, by which I don't mean women are stronger than men, but by which I mean where we share power, where we collaborate together, where we practice empathy, and we work in solidarity alongside each other. The counter to that might be some kind of hierarchy or patriarchy or exclusive power, power that's held by a few and not shared with others. And I think we're seeing this come out in many different ways, but definitely in this last decade, we've started a conversation about which kind of power do we want in the world? What kind of leaders do we want? How do they come together? And last but not least, our favorite C, COVID. And many of us, I'm in lockdown today, many of us have had to learn over this last year a whole new way of doing business, a whole new way of relating to each other. We've had to find extraordinary resilience inside of ourselves to be able to cope with this global crisis. Never before have we all faced the same enemy together, and yet somehow we're still competing with one another about the solution, about the vaccine, about where did it come from and how did this happen. So these 5 elements, complex conflicts, the rise of China and some new geopolitical dynamics, young people who are uncompromising and determined to change the system, to challenge the status quo, to deal with the big issues like climate change. Of course, COVID, but also this whole way that we handle and deal with power in leadership. And so this change in the way that our world works requires those of us who work for peace, those of us who are volunteering in Rotary to make a better world, people who want to show up and see how we transition all of this into something positive and bright into the next 100 years or even into the next 10. We need to think about what kind of leadership is required. And I'm very grateful for the topic of this event and for this particular presentation. At the risk of too many C's, I've talked about COVID and China and conflict and complexity. I want to talk about 6 other C's. The first is courageousness. And if anything, in this last year, we've shown courageousness. But for me, courageousness needs to go beyond. Courageousness is a willingness to try new things. Courageousness is to step across the divide into an opinion or a perspective that maybe we don't always agree with. Courageousness is to try empathy, to see if we can feel how others feel, to suspend judgment, to suspend stereotypes, perceptions, and prejudices. Courageousness challenges us in our core. It's a way of living that says, I'm not going to run into the line of fire, I'm not going to get shot at, but I am going to challenge myself to be more open, to hear from others, to try to understand more, to be vulnerable and authentic, and to see how that might change me and how that might change my world. The second is something that we've really practiced and realized we need in this last year, and that's connection. And somehow this Zoom world that we have quickly embraced shows us how much connection matters to us. That even when we were at home, we could be in the world, that we could be across borders, we could be across any kind of boundary. We could connect into webinars in other places, in other time zones. We could learn new things. We could listen to podcasts and enrich our learning. But what we really understood is that we need each other. And that's the fundamental nature of peace work. Conflicts are about relationships. Peace is about relationships. Relationships of equity, trust, being able to collaborate and work together. Collaboration is my third C. We need to find new ways of being partners together. The United Nations can't solve conflicts on its own. Civil society can't solve conflicts on our own. We can't resolve the issues of reconciliation in Australia without partnering with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We can't have government work without business, but neither can they work without universities such as the University of Melbourne, and nor can they ignore the significant contributions of organisations like Rotary. So collaboration is everything, because complexity requires a multifaceted response. And that comes when we can collaborate and work well together. Collaboration comes when we can suspend ego, when we can understand that it's not about me. It's not about the credit that I will get. It's not about me being the famous one. It's that when we collaborate and work well together, we actually have the possibility to share power, to share credit, to share the kudos, and to be one with each other. My fourth C is creativity. And actually, I've seen extraordinary creativity in this last year. I was somebody privileged to be in quarantine at some time, and I'm sure you've all seen the Instagram pictures of people doing amazing things with paper bags. It's time for us to apply that kind of creativity to the world. We need to do things differently. We can't do business as usual. The world is significantly different, and those young leaders are showing us what that looks like. We need to follow them. We need an extraordinary amount of humility to be able to say that many of us now, later in life, may not have the answers. But those young people shaped and born into a time in history where they can see possibilities, they can see ways forward, they can see a new reality which they will have to live in that maybe many of us couldn't see before. So we need to embrace creativity, possibility, different ways of doing things, and being willing to be led by those who have that level of creativity. Fifth, we need, and this is, I realize this is not a C, this is an uncompromising, there's a C in there, an uncompromising commitment. We cannot give up. We cannot be defeated by what might be superpowers and nuclear weapons, as we've heard. We cannot believe that peace is not always possible. Those young people in Myanmar have been showing us that there is no alternative future for them other than a world without a military that controls them. We see this time and time again around the world. That's what Greta stands for, uncompromising commitment to climate change. And so we have to embrace this commitment that we've been given. We have to show up every day. We have to believe that it's possible. We have to persist, because persistence pays, and we have to embrace this commitment. And last but not least, the field which I consider I work in is the field of conflict transformation. And that means that we're not just trying to put the lid on violence. It means that we are doing much more than conflict resolution. We're not just making peace agreements so people will calm down and stop fighting each other. Conflict transformation is about addressing the root causes of what causes conflicts today. Sometimes that's exclusion. Sometimes it's below the surface and we can't see it, but we know it's there. Sometimes it's about discrimination. Sometimes it's about inequitable access to justice or rules, to resources or land. But we have to identify that those things are what causes the kinds of physical violence that we see night after night on our television screens. So we need to look beyond what we see when somebody is being shot on a street. And we need to ask deeper questions about why. Where does this come from? Why does it happen? What is below the surface? And we need to work deeply into that. I would say that in Australia, we need to do that increasingly more. We need to ask ourselves, what is behind the nightly chatter that we see on our televisions? What's going on deep in our society? What values do we hold? We can talk about peace overseas, but we also need to dig deeply into peace at home. So I want to say that the next 100 years counts, the next 10 years count, but they only count when we embrace the next 100 days. And so my challenge to everybody in this beautiful Zoom room today is for us to embrace those values, to commit, to be courageous, to be creative, to find ways to collaborate and to connect with one another, to communicate more, but above all, to seek to transform those conflicts that are so complex and so crazy and so unbearable and intolerable to people of humanity. And I look forward to being on that journey with you all. On this birthday, I hope that we take the spirit of the Stotts Hotel, not just the alcohol spirit, not the beers they drank that day, although it would be nice to have one with all of you, but equally the energy and spirit of those early Rotarians who had a grand vision and a grand possibility to take forward their agenda, most especially their agenda for peace. Thank you so much.